All righty, let's get this ball rolling here. So I would like to say good day to you all. Thank you for joining us here at our Cybersecurity Awareness Month presentation on how to create a secure virtual office. This is a joint presentation, a collaborative effort between government, industry, to raise and here at the Estus Group to raise awareness about the importance of cybersecurity. If you've seen any of my past webinars, you've seen me rant and rave about how important security is, and this is just an ongoing effort to kind of keep that ball in the air, so to speak. In fact, I was teaching security classes when 9/11 happened, which was another security event, and I wanted to and been beating this drum for a long time, so I wanted to bring to you how we can create a, I don't say more, not perfectly secure, but a more secure virtual office, as we've certainly seen in this day and age, post-pandemic. What does that look like, and how can we model this and make life easier for us rather than harder? So, of course, with this effort, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, that's a mouthful, CISA, is the federal lead for this Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We've had a couple of events going on already, and I am pleased to be the tail end of this. Let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like for you all. So I will be talking today about how to create secure virtual office solutions. However, in this month of cybersecurity, October certainly means all sorts of fun things. We have that big candy holiday, which is going to look very different this year than previous years. We can't forget those pumpkin spice lattes, and of course, Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Personally, I think we should have cybersecurity awareness every day. That way folks would be a little more conscious of it as they make decisions with specifically their IT infrastructure as it relates to me. So when we look at this, this is, if you connect it, you got to protect it, right? There are too many people for too many years have been coming along and just plugging things together and going, wow, it works, right? It's a minor miracle when I get my wireless printer to work with my wireless devices on the home network. And so we need to be more aware that not everything is coming with security baked in. Anybody who has a Ring doorbell, was aware of some of the security issues around that. And there's a lot of home devices that are being attacked. And so with that Internet of Things, the IoT, they're looking at 41 billion devices there on the interweb. So with all those devices, we need to bake security into that. 75% of those infected devices are used, are routers used in that Internet of Things attack. You've got a home router, then it's part of the equation, and we need to keep it secure. Now, that's not my talk today, but it's a key issue when we look at protecting that remote office. The statistic about 5 minutes, 24 hours is actually relatively old. It used to be that when you turned on a remote desktop server and you exposed it to the internet, it was pretty much found and targeted very, very quickly. So remote desktop servers, and they were used a lot in the past couple of months to make sure that users get where they need to be, are certainly vulnerable points. So you can't just plug something in and assume it's secure. In fact, assume it's insecure and protect it. So if you're interested about some of the Internet of Things and you're curious about watching some cool stuff, go to a website called shodan.io. That's SHODAN.io. And you'll see some of these statistics coming into play that we are talking about this week. So with this week is our last week of our Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We're talking about the future of connected devices. And what I thought I'd do is bring to the equation some of the challenges that I'm seeing, that the Estus Group is seeing, as we saw companies move out of the corporate physical office and into this virtual office world. So there's a number of different caveats to come into play, and hopefully I'll share some of the things that you're vulnerable to, shall I say. in this new brave new world that we live in. So the future of connected devices. So let's take a quick look at the history. We had this thing called the virtual office in 2019, or before 2020, shall I say. And the virtual office isn't new, right? Many small businesses leverage the virtual office to make themselves seem bigger than they were. For example, a physical office, as we all know, there's space for people and to collect paper, right? Invoices and copies of agreements and products. If you're a manufacturer, you build things and you got to be able to, collect the materials and put them together and store them. So that was certainly one reason that people had a physical location. It was also collaboration spaces where you would have meeting rooms and cube farms and all sorts of ways to get not only your employees together, but staff with clients and vendors, right? So you have the official meeting room that you had to book, as opposed to just these conference spaces where people could get together. Particularly near and dear to me is the technology data center, right? We'd have a rack of servers, and it would be in an air-conditioned room, and it would be the data center, and that's where all of our golden nuggets were stored. More about that later. And one of the important things that a physical office provided that people quickly realized was missing is the water cooler conversations. Now, you might consider them a distraction, because if I'm walking down the hall to get to the water cooler, I just want my water. Don't bother me with IT questions. On the other hand, it's a great way to get the pulse of the company and the feel for who's doing what new projects are abounding. And that water cooler conversation, you might also call it the cigarette break conversation, was actually a key part of a physical office space. So virtual offices basically took that physical space and it allowed smaller companies to be entirely virtual. There was no physical location. So I'd have 123 Anywhere Street that would collect at a mailbox, and I would be able to scan all my mail and read my mail without actually going to physically pick it up. A little difficult to get packages that way, but okay. It was a shared meeting space where you would rent a space when you need it to meet with clients and vendors. Of course, you'd have your virtual phone assistant, maybe a physical person, right? The phones have been virtualized or voice over IP for a long time, to where, press 1 to get sales, 2 for support. And one I thought I'd just add recently was faxing solutions, right? A lot of companies have faxes, and you have to walk up to that physical machine and plug in the piece of paper. And when we all went home to work, that faxing became a little bit more difficult. So we'll talk about that in a little bit later as well. So the virtual office isn't new, right? And smaller companies would typically take advantage of it. But what we're now seeing is a transition, because not only do we have virtual offices before, but typical corporate enterprises had this thing called the data center. And the data center in most small businesses was, as I mentioned before, a room maybe with air conditioning, fire suppression equipment, a couple of racks, bunch of wires. And it's where the golden nuggets of that business were stored. So with that smaller company, they would maintain their own server room. They'd have their own switches and access points. They'd have a bunch of workstations, maybe wireless, wired, depending on your industry. And then you have a firewall. And if you were really advanced, you'd have redundant firewalls with redundant ISPs, so that as we move to the internet, just the failure of Comcast doesn't take out your entire business. Now, bigger companies certainly had this as well, but the bigger companies had more mature centralized IT. Maybe they had 2 server rooms or redundant locations, and they had redundant fabric, and workstations were segmented away from servers and redundant firewalls, as I mentioned. But typically in your smaller enterprises, this was easy to identify, and it was also fairly vulnerable. So when we had that centralized IT server room, then when people went home, it was relatively challenged to get to that corporate data, right? Remote access was available to those folks that were vetted for it. They were specially trained on how to VPN. They were given permissions. If you use remote desktop or terminal services, they were given access to that terminal server environment, which was not cheap or easy to maintain, but certainly available. And those companies might have had a large remote workforce, had more mature remote access. However, in the corporate data center, it's key to note that the protection was all centered or ringed around those critical assets. Usually it's your servers, right? It was where the golden nuggets of the organization. Here at Estus Group, we deal with this product called Epicor, which is an ERP package. And typically that was installed on a server in a rack, in the farm, in the server room, and all of the workstations surrounded that. And that's where we spent most of our time maintaining and protecting those critical assets. So the corporate data center, it could have just been a server closet. I can't tell you the number of servers that were stuck in the broom closet. They were locked right. Literally, there was a vacuum cleaner next to the server. Wasn't a great big enterprise, but that was the only protected place they could lock the door. So again, scalability is a question there, but keep in mind that most small businesses for a long time had this data center, and finding that getting people to that in this new age was a challenge. So we then had this interesting thing happen back in March, which you might have been a participatory in, hopefully not significantly, but where we had a transition from the physical office space over to a very, very virtual office space. What we found is that most non-essential personnel were sent home, right? On March 13th, it was a very different day for us at the Estus Group. And we basically said, you know what, don't show up at the office. It's not worth it. So IT scrambled to find ways to keep those now remote users productive. And businesses that were already focused on that virtual office space were very well positioned. Okay. In fact, some companies, it wasn't a big issue at all. People were already remote. They had a policy, they had the documentation, they had the laptops, they had everything that was needed. It was just a matter of a slight change of plans. However, there were many businesses that were not ready. And based on your technology sector or your industry sector, pardon me, how did they suffer? How much did they suffer really is dependent upon that industry. But they suffered in many areas. There was a productivity loss, right? There wasn't somebody there to answer the phones. And if you didn't take into account, oh, we can move a phone to a home office, phones rang, call times went through the roof. There was a loss of accountability. What are my users doing? If I sent them home to work, how did I know if they were really working? Maybe they're sitting there watching YouTube videos. I don't know. And obviously the security, which is primary focus here of our webinar series on Cybersecurity Awareness Month. But the security, believe it or not, actually dropped significantly for those businesses that weren't positioned to go remote. And so what I'd like to do is take into account some of these different areas in which you might be suffering, and give you some really hands-on material that you can grab and run with. And if you found yourself in that corporate data center and now you're not, let's see what we can do to help you out there. So in March, as we all know, non-essential businesses closed. That is, people were sent, well, the business didn't close. Hopefully it didn't close. I guess if your business closed, you probably wouldn't be watching my webinar today. But what we really saw was that based on your industry, there was a different impact, right? The primary industries here, right? If you were involved in raw materials production, right, you have to have people on the floor or on the ground gathering the raw materials and processing them and shipping them. If you're in the manufacturing industry, you are responsible for receiving those raw materials, putting them together in parts that could have been highly automated. But usually there's some oversight. Somebody's got to put an order in and make it show up on the machine somewhere. And what we saw in Estes Group is focused around this manufacturing and warehousing and distribution channel. What we saw is that a lot of companies were okay for a really short period of time. We can do without computers for 24 hours, but after 24 hours, the production lines stop because they don't know what to produce. Maybe it takes a couple of days for you, but in manufacturing, the cost of downtime grows significantly the longer you're down, and we run out of orders to fill. In the services industry, right, we saw a lot of restaurants and bars and all those folks closed. Information services, believe it or not, where I live in most of my day job, changed very little. I already worked from my wonderful home office with a cow on the wall. Don't ask me why it's a cow, but it's something that's not personal. And by the way, you can't really derive a whole lot of where I am from my home office. That's a security aspect. But information services was really ideally positioned to go remote. Human services, maybe not so much. It's really hard to call somebody into my office to have a conversation. So we have to do it all virtually now over Zoom or Teams or what have you. So when you look at your industry sector, that really is going to determine how much you were impacted by the pandemic. Now, some businesses lost significant productivity, right? And focused around the IT space, right? If users can't work from home, you sent them home, but they couldn't do anything. There wasn't a phone, they didn't have a computer, they couldn't get at their data. They sat and twiddled their thumbs, and many of those users lost their job because they couldn't be productive. Correspondingly, there wasn't staff in the office to maintain those IT systems. So if you have to have somebody in the office to watch the lights go blinky blinky, and swap hard drives and fix reboot routers and do that kind of stuff, it's kind of hard to do that remotely if you weren't planned for it. So the staff that wasn't in the office to maintain those systems caused a detriment. So that was some significant number of businesses. Other businesses did struggle, but they kept up the good fight. Those that had a VPN, they found that their VPN usage went through the roof. Those folks that had a remote access policy now had a whole lot more people doing remote access. So terminal servers groaned and VPN servers and certainly internet groaned as everyone went home under the load of doing that. And then there are other businesses that barely lost a beat. It was business as usual. In fact, we see a lot of the smaller businesses now that are all cloud-based. They're not manufacturers, they're not raw materials, they're not services, right? They're more IT or human services, but they were already remote. And I'm actually thankful that the Estus Group fell into that. So I speak from personal experience here that literally when we closed our office, it was a matter of locking the door and saying, okay, you're working from home today. Because we have snow days here in Colorado, and that often caused us to work from home. But chances are, if you were doing business with the Estus Group, the difference between March 12th and March 15th wasn't a big deal. Yes, we did have to modify our travel policies. We do have consultants that actually went on site. Can you believe it? Without a mask. And they would go to the plants where we actually do our consulting work, and they go out, and that's starting to come back a little bit. But for the most part, we have a mature remote access solution, and we didn't lose a beat. So again, depending on your vulnerabilities and where you fall in this spectrum here, you might still very well be struggling with those productivity, accountability, and security issues, as I mentioned before. So really what happened though is those traditional businesses that were based around the corporate data center, things started falling apart. Not only from a process standpoint, how do we do business over Zoom? How do we collaborate over Teams? When I can't physically see my coworkers, a lot of that productivity started dropping. And then there was this whole technology. If you weren't designed to go remote, then you had a bunch of things that started falling apart. For example, a lot of people realize that if you take a workstation out of Active Directory and you leave it away from Active Directory for more than 30 days, it is not happy when it comes back into Active Directory. There's a 30-day domain trust issue that we've known about in AD for years, but people started seeing that. And it only happened after 30 days from being gone, right? So I was home for a month and then I brought my laptop back. IT would have to get involved to put that laptop back in Active Directory because it fell out. WSUS, which is Microsoft's update services, right? Windows Server update services, wouldn't deliver patches outside the firewall. Your workstation was dependent upon getting the latest Windows updates by being inside the corporate firewall at least once a month, right? Or drop in there and plug in your laptop and we'll deliver patches. Now, I'm not saying that WSUS can't deliver patches outside the firewall. It can, but if you didn't plan for it, it didn't. Antivirus is another one. Antivirus often gets updated from a corporate server. right? Semantic endpoint protection, for example, a classic tool that many companies use, and its antivirus signatures came from a file server. All right, you called it your endpoint manager server. And if your workstation didn't check in, then it didn't get antivirus updates, nor did it phone home to say, hey, I'm good. There's no malware on my machine. I'm still running antivirus. By the way, the first thing malware does is it tries to turn off your antivirus. So if your antivirus isn't phoning home and getting monitored, you might have a problem and just not know it yet. So antivirus wouldn't get updated. And of course, if you based a lot of your security around the corporate firewall, web protection, gateway security, gateway antivirus, you can't go to facebook.com, was all in the corporate firewall. And if you took a laptop and you walked out from the corporate firewall, now that isn't there to protect the users. And I really have to say from themselves, right? Users will click on stuff. They want their MTV. They're used to having, corporate protecting them from doing really stupid things. So they were kind of loosey-goosey when it came to their behaviors. And now we're sitting from home. And that corporate firewall is not here anymore to protect the users from themselves. So then what we found is that those VPNs that might have been in place really weren't designed to replace the internet. The VPN architecture wasn't robust enough, or we didn't have a good enough laser beam focus. I've got more on that later. And so VPNs struggled, and they're really not a replacement for Ethernet, right? A slow VPN connection, even if you've got a cable modem, is not as fast as a gigabit Ethernet. So we lost control, basically, when people went home. And in trying to regain control, corporations struggled with all of these different aspects, as well as the productivity and the accountability aspects, to try and get users back up and running. I'm focused kind of on the technology because it's my personal special interest, shall we say. So what happened then is VPNs started sprouting up. Everybody thought, oh, VPN, that's the answer. So they turned on the VPN architecture. They rolled out a bunch of VPN clients and said, everybody VPN in, and now you can get to your content. You can get to the golden nuggets of the network. You can run Epicor. You can get to the resources needed to do your job. There's only one problem. Most VPNs that I see today, not all, but most, are insecure. Now, a VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. Just the initials connote this. It must be secure because it's encrypted and it's authenticated, and it might even be audited. But if your VPN is only protected with a name and a password, well, then it can be hacked, right? If it's just a name and a password and it's a silly password or one that can be brute forced, then it can be hacked. And if you're, believe it or not, there's malware that's been written for specific VPN clients, that if you get this malware on your home computer and you have that particular VPN client, and I want to point out any vendors, because if I mention a vendor, then tomorrow they'll add a new one to the malware list. We're written to steal your credentials. So if it's just a name and a password, malware can be written to steal that password, phone home, and now your name and password is back on the dark web. Now, what's also important to note is that the threats that you might have on your workstation, that loosey-goosey user can piggyback over your VPN to infiltrate the network. So if I've got malware sitting on my home computer and I can VPN in, whether I use multi-factor authentication or tokens or all sorts of things, if that VPN allows me access to not only servers, but workstations and cameras and the IoT that might not be well patched because you assumed the camera was safe because it was behind the corporate firewall. Well, if so, then your VPN might allow your home malware to become corporate malware, right? Because if I can access everything, then any program that's running on my computer can access everything. And if I've got malware on my computer and I don't know it, then it can sneak across that VPN. Now you might say, well, Daryl, how can you have malware and not know it? Well, I point out a statistic that your average ransomware has a dwell time. Dwell time is the industry term for How long is the ransom in your network tucked under and not raising its ugly head until the bad guys want to blow it up? Has a dwell time of 140 days, might be 142 months, that you can have malware in your systems, and that could be on your home machine. Now, your corporate systems, they have your regular antivirus scans, and they're monitored, and we know what's going on. Imagine the difficulty now when you're trying to do a scan of a machine that's at home that you really can't get to because it's not there on the Ethernet. So obviously there's some risks here. We want to make sure that that you have more than just a name and a password protecting your VPN. In fact, some VPNs are just SSL based. That is, you visit a web page, it says enter your name and password, and voila, it's installed, and you are now on the corporate network. Protected, right? Well, no. Yes, it's encrypted. Yes, it's authenticated, but the home malware becomes your corporate malware, and it's easy to get in. In fact, what if it wasn't you that was logging in, but the bad guys that stole your password? Now the bad guys are in your network. Also, one of the big challenges I see with VPNs is they use this thing called split tunnel. That's a technical term that basically says that when I'm at home and I VPN in, all my corporate work goes through the corporate tunnel, and all of my YouTube surfing goes straight out my Comcast connection. And the users love it because YouTube is fast, right? And they just only have to deal with the bottleneck of the corporate VPN to get corporate data. Well, the problem with that split tunnel is now I can be watching YouTube videos while I'm doing corporate work. One can only imagine that there's potentially a productivity issue involved there, but also that any malware that I get on my browser because I'm surfing YouTube and Google and all these really dangerous websites, potentially getting infected, and now that infection can jump across to the corporate VPN. So what we're seeing here is that the bad guys came home with you, and they're attacking these vulnerabilities that before March, they were still there, but they weren't really exposed. They weren't used that much. We have so many more home workers nowadays that the bad guys they're looking for the easiest target. And if I can infect a home computer and piggyback, well, then it's easy, right? So most VPNs today are insecure. So I would argue that you might already be behind the 8 ball. That is, whoops, everybody went home and we scrambled, and now we're seeing these issues come along. So let's talk about what are some of the, I'd say the top 3 things that I can do right now to deal with my home users. First off is define a work from home policy. It's a piece of paper, all right, it might be a Word document, I don't care, that users have to sign to be able to work from home. And basically that work from home policy, and I can give you templates if you need them, just Google it. Make sure that you only click on the valid links and not all the spyware links. Actually, Google's pretty good about filtering out all the malware from their engines. But that work from home policy says, if you forget your password, this is what you do. If your home computer is stolen, this is what you do. These are the steps that you have to take in order to be able to VPN in, right? The work from home policy, which basically documents to the end user, the one that's working from home, what happens in each of these scenarios. So that's first and foremost, because it gives you teeth that you can then use to bite the end user if they don't do it right, right? If the home user gets hacked and they didn't follow your policy, then you can point the finger back at them and say, you forgot to run antivirus. Now, arguably, what IT administrator would let the end user install antivirus on their home computer? That's ridiculous. We can't rely on the end user to be able to type their password, much less install antivirus. I'm sorry, I should be nicer to the end users. I might have some of them out there. So if recommend, if possible, please deploy work laptops. A work laptop is one that you own, that you encrypted, that you put the VPN client on, that you have control over it, and it's got all the controls necessary for you to manage that laptop, even though it's not in the corporate network. Okay, that's ideal. If you can't deal with that, then you have to deal with all of the insanity of the home computer. Insufficient resources. They didn't have Word installed. They don't know how to VPN, et cetera, et cetera. Number 2, securing the home network. One of the key ways the bad guys are breaking in now is they exploit your home firewall. How do they do that? There's a number of different ways, but if you don't keep your home firewall patched up, latest firmware updates, then the bad guys are banging on the door. Most home firewalls, believe it or not, are accessible from the outside. That is, they have a management console that they can go to port 8080, right, if you run a Netgear, or if you run a Linksys, I think it was port 8088, where you get a login screen and you can start banging on names and passwords, and Shodan.io will show you all of the cameras and all of the routers in the world that have default usernames and passwords. Anything default username, default password needs to be changed because the bad guys know them, right? I know that Linksys passwords are admin and password unless you change it. So change not only the SSID, right? That's the home Wi-Fi network name. Why would you change that? Because often people leave that at default. And in the SSID, it says, I'm a Netgear. All right, let's put some random letter in there. But if I know you're running a Netgear, then I know what the router is and I know what the vulnerabilities are. So I can start banging on known Netgear vulnerabilities. Now, I'm not saying that Netgear is a bad router. An unpatched router is a bad router. One that has admin and password as the login is bad. And so therefore change not only the network name, but those other login defaults. And there's lots of things that you can do. Arguably, you want to turn off universal plug and play, UPnP. It's what kids use to play video games across the NATed network. That's a vulnerability. You want to turn that off as well. In fact, you might even want to separate your work devices from the rest of the untrusted devices on your home network, just like we do at corporate. Corporate, the servers are in the corner, firewalled away from all the workstations and definitely all the Wi-Fi. Okay, why would you put valuable targets right next to vulnerable devices like your kid's computer, right? Most people have kids' computers sitting on the same network, whether it's Wi-Fi or LAN, I don't care, the same network as your work machine. And if the kid's machine gets attacked and compromised, now the kid's machine becomes a vector for infection. And that means that, okay, it would be nice if we could protect all of our kids from the internet, but imagine trying to keep our kids off of my computer. Now, I don't let my kids type on my computer, right? I have a name and a password and a thumbprint and a PIN and everything to protect my computer, physical segregation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that my kid's computer can't ping my computer. And if my home firewall isn't on and my home antivirus isn't up to date, and I have vulnerabilities on my home computer, then the untrusted machine next door, or in this case down the hall, might be attacking my computer. Now, don't go run into your kid and say, why are you hacking my computer? Right? It's not the kid that's probably not the kid that's trying to hack your computer. It's the program that's running on the kid's computer. And then step 3 is to deploy those cloud solutions for all the controls that you just lost in the previous slide. So there's a lot of different ways to deploy cloud solutions. One of those things I would look at is to make sure that your VPN solution is secure. If you still want to use VPN, that's an option. You want to keep your firewall patched, deploy multi-factor authentication, whether it's a little token that, with 6 digits that changes on my phone, or it's a USB plug that I got to plug in, or it's a digital certificate. There's lots of ways, but make it something that you know, your name and password, and something that you have that the bad guys don't have or can't easily get. Okay, if you just rely on name and a password, it's not secure. Ideally, if you can geofence. Geofencing is geographic fencing. I know all of the IP addresses that originate in the United States. And in our hosting solution, by default, I only let US addresses even try to connect to our hosted solution. So why are you going to allow people from overseas to try and VPN unless they're your employees, in which case you have to make that exception? Think laser and not subnet or floodlight. In other words, when you open up that VPN, say, yep, when the VPN is established, you can get to that server and that printer and not the whole subnet. Okay, that way, if there's malware on the remote machine, that's only can possibly target that server or that printer. Not that I really want to hack a printer, but printers run software, they're hackable, believe it or not. There's other types of VPN solutions. We use a product called Zero Tier here at the Estus Group, and this is a VPN solution when I need to connect 2 machines together with multi-factor authentication, and I don't need to spend a lot of time or money thinking about how to do it in a secure fashion. There's other types of solutions. Zero tier is a pretty slick solution. It's come about, it's matured as of late, obviously, but that's a great way to create a VPN without having to worry about a bunch of infrastructure. So the next thing I want to talk about is this thing called cloud, right? People have been talking about cloud for years. This is nothing new, but I do want to point out that first off, cloud simply means somebody else's computer or computers, right? So cloud isn't this magical panacea. However, if it's somebody else's computer and their full-time job is to secure it and keep it backed up and keep it redundant, then chances are they're doing it better than you can do it, especially if you're not a security expert or a infrastructure expert or have all the redundancy that a mature data center has. So to that end, cloud, don't assume that it's secure. You still need to validate it. You still need to look at it with the hacker's mindset and go, what if something bad happened? What can you do, Mr. Provider, to make sure, or Ms. Provider, to make sure that this isn't going to be a problem for me? Because you can actually create your own cloud solutions. Anybody right now who runs a hypervisor and a bunch of VMs could be considered to have their own private cloud. Right? It's easy to spin up a new server. You don't have to buy new hardware. It's just a new virtual machine. And this has been done for years. And you can do that right in your own office, right? Cloud providers, though, probably have a more secure and redundant data center than you do. In fact, in most small businesses, you're lucky to have a tier 1 data center. Now, tier 1 is the lowest data center, that is the least mature, right? A tier 1 data center, you've got UPSs that protect your server. So if the power goes out or flashes, all your servers don't drop, right? Because servers hate to drop, not just physically, but power-wise. But maybe you don't have a generator. And if you have a generator, maybe you forgot to test it this year, and so the gas went bad, right? We found that in Y2K, a lot of people were surprised that their generators didn't work. Not that Y2K caused power outages, thank goodness, but nonetheless, in preparation for Y2K, they would go out and fire up their generator only to find out that the spark plugs were corroded for years, and they had no gas, or it turned into kerosene or whatever. So you probably don't have a generator. You probably don't have redundant internet connections. You probably don't have redundant data centers. You probably don't have the stuff that tier 2, 3, and 4 data centers have in this day and age to provide that level of redundancy. Now, you can certainly buy them. And if you want to make yourself a data center, by all means. Here at the Estus Group, we actually chose to not have a data center because it's not our core value. It's not our core expertise. So we partnered with a data center that does it a whole lot better than we could. So to that end, just because it's cloud doesn't mean it's secure, and you can really build your own cloud is the takeaway. But is it worth it? Right? Do you have time and money and personnel to build your own cloud? So if you don't, take advantage of somebody else's. So there's several different types of clouds, right? There's a public cloud that we all know, Amazon, web services, Azure, Google, HP, they've all got their own cloud, right? You could call them public clouds because anybody can go to these companies and say, I would like to buy 3 CPUs and 400 gigs of RAM, disk space, and a couple of network connections, and you too can have a server running in the cloud without very much effort at all. Still your server, you still get to manage it, but it's just running in somebody else's hardware. You could also go with a private label cloud, much like the Estus Group. But these are smaller companies that they have tier 2 or better data centers, and they provide a levels of redundancy and power and controls such that they're generally more agile, more cost-effective, and easier to talk to than your public clouds. I don't know for anybody who's ever tried to call Microsoft lately. Hi, Microsoft, I'm having a problem with my server. Can you reboot it? You're not going to call somebody on Microsoft and get somebody at Microsoft or Amazon for that matter. Yes, you can open a ticket. Yes, somebody will answer the ticket. They might have English as a first language. Not that I'm biased, but it's nice to be able to communicate clearly going, I have a problem and I need it fixed now because my users are down. With a smaller company, they're more agile and are easier to deal with. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't roll your own, as I mentioned before. You can create your own data center, whether you use Docker or Kubernetes or virtualization or Hyper-V or VMware. There's all sorts of acronyms I can throw out for you. I don't care. But it does require that you invest in hardware, internet, and the personnel to monitor it. Oh, yeah, and the ongoing hardware costs because hard drives break, right? Routers need updating. Ethernet switches get slow. These kinds of things. So it requires monitoring tools to be able to watch all of this. And that's one of the things that you're getting when you buy into a public or private cloud infrastructure. And then there's this thing called a hybrid. A hybrid is where we marry your personal, on-premise, your corporate IT to whether it's public or private cloud architecture. And I've been doing this one for years. A lot of people who used to have Exchange servers on-premise and now moved to Office 365, they created this server that was in the middle called an Exchange hybrid server. And it was responsible for moving mail and users and address books from on-premise to cloud. Actually, it's pretty cool. You could move from cloud back to on-premise if you wanted to, but it blurred the lines between what is corporate data and what is cloud data, right? What data sits on my inside architecture and what data sits out in the cloud. Now, as a security person, I very much care about that because where it physically lives is where the bad guys are running to, right? If the bad guys want to break into my boss's mailbox, they don't care whether the mailbox is on cloud or it's on-prem. Guarantee you, Microsoft does a better job at protecting mailboxes in the cloud than you can protecting the same mailbox on-prem. And why is that? Because they have the resources necessary to invest in things like the spam filtering and the account protection and the multi-factor authentication, stuff that's expensive for small companies to incorporate, potentially expensive. So hybrid is where we see a lot of the different environments going. And the challenge here is that a lot of small businesses don't just deal with one cloud. They deal with multiple clouds, right? So for example, you might have an Office 365 tenant, and you might have a Estus Group tenant, and you might have a Salesforce tenant, and you might have a Zoom tenant. And all of these different cloud environments ideally are going to be tied together in such a way where you don't have to remember, now, where do I go to turn on a user? How many different places do I need to light up in order to provision, or more importantly, deprovision a user? So when we take the move to the cloud, there's a number of different facets that we need to be aware of. The first one is, obviously, when you move to the cloud, you're moving away from a server-centric environment, away from Active Directory and possibly towards Azure Active Directory. Now, Azure AD is not the only one. There's other Active Directory replacements, but they're not dependent upon servers running in your data center. You're going to move probably to endpoint detection and response tools. That's called antivirus, patching, all of that stuff. And we're going to move those to the cloud, right? So now workstations don't have to be connected to the corporate data center to get antivirus updates. And you have to deploy applications. And you have to be able to remote access to these machines. So you might use something like Microsoft Intune or Microsoft Endpoint Management. Those are just two Microsoft tools. There are several third-party. In fact, we use third-party by default in our managed services. That's all cloud-based, right? In fact, it can actually survive the failure of the network connection. So a user can still be protected even if the internet is down. Makes it a little difficult to get to cloud data, but that's why we have OneDrive. Okay, so you move away from that server-centric, and you also move away from the server-centric data, right? For example, data doesn't have to live only in the cloud. Anybody who's used OneDrive has the opportunity to synchronize corporate documents to their C drive. Keep in mind that if you synchronize corporate documents to your C drive, now the bad guys are going to try and attack your C drive. So I strongly encourage protection on your workstation, encryption, two-factor authentication, antivirus, patching, all that good stuff that keeps PCs secure. So Office 365 is a great way to bring data local. And you can also use other cloud solutions. You can put your ERP in the cloud, your CRM, accounting software, QuickBooks Online, love it or hate it, it's only one or the other. But people have been using QuickBooks Online, and that way you don't have to be dependent upon people remoting in to use QuickBooks on premise, right? And by the way, never try and do QuickBooks over a VPN. It doesn't work. Okay, so the key here though is you got to keep tabs on the user identity, because through all of this, the user becomes the focus of the access. It's the user that is the weakest point in most systems. Okay, and if you don't deprovision and provision users through either single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, then you've got hanging chads. Probably shouldn't use that term here in the end of October, but you've got hanging chads of users that might be floating out there. When a user leaves the company, I ideally would have one master switch that goes, this user is disabled, and they can no longer access, VPN, RDP, Salesforce, the cloud services, Office 365. Oh, never mind what to do with all of the data that they owned. But that single switch disabling is real key. And some clouds lend themselves to that very well. More and more cloud providers are, for example, are using Azure as the authentication point. So if you have an Office 365 tenant, then you can use that for your workstation login, for your Epicor login, for your Zoom login, for your whatever login. And that way, if they all come back to Azure to get their logins, when you disable a user in Azure, they're immediately turned off in all the other systems. So that's really handy. Before, in the day, before a year ago, people were looking at Active Directory, and Active Directory was the directory service to turn everybody off. So in this case, we have to still keep tabs on that user identity. It's one of the bigger vulnerabilities of even cloud computing. So just to let you know that Estus Group's been doing this for a long time. We've been ERP specialists for 15 years. We've been doing the private and hybrid clouds for, depending on how you look at it, the 5 years within the Estes Group. The fact that our staff has been doing it for 15 years as well in various capacities gives us a deep understanding of what your business needs to be able to move away from the corporate data center and into the truly virtual office. And that could be helping with a private cloud or a hybrid cloud. Yes, I can do Azure and Amazon if you really want us to, but there are some vulnerabilities, not vulnerabilities, there's some challenges involved in those big public cloud providers. I'd be happy to take up in another conversation. We can certainly help with Office 365, right? Your file server that you keep on-prem is probably so 90s. Hopefully it's not running an old 90s operating system, but at least it's the file server technology has changed significantly, and Microsoft has really been a game changer in that space. So Office 365 isn't just email anymore. It's documents and workflow and form, and lots of good stuff. And so therefore, there's a lot of different tools that we can bring to the table that will help you kind of bring all of that under a single umbrella. And we'd be happy to talk to you in more details after the conversation. I did forget to mention at the very beginning here, I am monitoring the Q&A and the Zoom chat, which has been remarkably quiet so far. And I've been up on my soapbox here for almost an hour now. So let me wrap up a little bit here to talk about some of the ways that you can continue this cyber smartness, as it were. So you can actually sign your company up to be a cybersecurity champion. It's a great way to go through a toolkit that says, hey, these are things that you can do to make your systems more secure, at least to be aware that you need to do these things, much like the things I just listed in today's presentation. You can encourage your colleagues, friends, and family to join. You can post on social media, be responsible there, right? There's a number of blogging opportunities, and I'd be happy to help you raise that awareness in your company as well. Your own role, right? It's first and foremost the individual's job to own their security, right? My kids are responsible for locking the car doors when they leave the car. A lot of cars do that by themselves nowadays, but it's their responsibility. So I make them own a part of the security. It's my end user's responsibility to log off when they're done. Although I do have a screensaver with a password protection if they walk away from their computer and they forget to lock their machine. Yes, I can even do that in the distributed environment. So lockdown, right? When in doubt, throw it out there. Just talking about get rid of the old data, get rid of the old computers, keep a clean machine if you can. Back it up, because obviously one little hard drive here at home can fail. Murphy says it will fail. So we use Office 365 to synchronize all of our important documents between local machines in the cloud. You have to make sure that you're owning your presence, right? I tell my kids there's nothing you post online that isn't remembered forever. And Facebook has been notoriously guilty of that as of late. Share with care, and make sure that you're not just connecting to any old Wi-Fi, especially if you're not using a VPN. Wi-Fi is not secure. And I've ranted and raved about that a little while before, but nonetheless, that's an important aspect. Okay, so it's everybody's job. Any questions? So I've been going on for quite a while here. I do appreciate your time and attention to this. If you have any questions, I can hang out here for another 10 minutes as we wrap up the webinar. But I just wanted to thank you for your time. If you've been seeing this in a recorded session, please reach out to us at EstesGroup or EstesGroup.com. And I look forward to sharing more information with you on a one-on-one basis. So with that, I appreciate it. And I am going to hang out here and see if there's any questions. We did have one question here about the URL. Again, I think the URL, a couple is that I mentioned here. Shodan.io is the list of all known cameras and the Internet of Things. So SHODAN.io. Particularly dangerous, not dangerous, revealing website, shall I say. While I'm at it and sharing URLs, I might as well mention the Have I Been Pwned website. Pwned, by the way, spelled P-W-N, is hacker speak for I own your butt. So when we look at have, H-A-V-E-I, the letter I, been, B-E-N, Pwned.com. This is going to tell you if your email address has been involved in a dark web security breach. That is your name out there on the dark web? Probably yes, okay, because there's been enough breaches of known databases, and all of those breaches, they contain your email address, maybe your name, maybe your social, maybe your password, maybe it was your password but it was encrypted, which requires some work to get to. Maybe it was just all your secret questions that you answered on Facebook involved in a breach. And over the years, there have been so many breaches that if you used your corporate email address and your corporate password, chances are it's on the dark web. Don't be surprised. Now, don't freak out. What do? You change your password. Don't change it to one you've used before. Don't change it to one that you always use, because that was the one that got hacked and sold on the dark web years ago. And better yet, rather than relying on just a name and a password, use multi-factor authentication. So it's not just something you know, but it's something that you have. Now, multi-factor authentication is something that most people associate with Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator. But something that you have could be something like a unique IP address, a unique certificate. It could be something that, again, it's not a thing that you write down on a Post-it note, but rather something that's harder to let slip on the dark web. Now, a certificate or an IP address can be stolen or spoofed, but it is far less likely than your name and password, because most users are creatures of habit, and they will use the same password or a derivative of the same password in multiple locations. So if I use password X on Facebook, I'll use password Y on LinkedIn, and then I use password Z on my corporate network, and we wonder why we get hacked, right? So we don't use the same passwords in multiple locations, but passwords are becoming a thing of the past. They're becoming a part of the solution. But for all of you that authenticate to 365 with a PIN number or facial recognition, right? Windows 10 hello, and occasionally we're using multi-factor authentication. These are all ways that Microsoft is moving aggressively away from passwords and towards better security measures that can't be hacked, because passwords have been known to be a weak point in most security solutions. Okay, I'm going to jump down off my soapbox. I really appreciate your time, folks. If you have any other questions, please feel free to post them here. I got a few more minutes. Otherwise, you can email me, dsirota@estesgrp.com is my address. It's the beginning of the presentation. We will make this presentation available. We have here just a couple of more links for you for the staysafeonline.org to help you become more security aware. And with that, I say thank you very much. Be safe out there.